morning. Good morning to everyone who's listening and patching into our next episode of Signet Unpackaged. Today, we have a really great guest who I've had the opportunity to meet a few weeks back. And so may I introduce you all to Colin Spolman. He is co-founder of Kings County Distillery, the oldest distillery in New York City, which we'll dabble into a little in this podcast. And he's also a reputable thought leader and author of multiple best-selling books that center around the roots of real American whiskey. Now, hopefully, I didn't miss out anything there, Colin, but hello.
Thank you. That's a very favorable presentation. Only one of the books sells well. One of the books is coming out on May 14th. So very soon. So we will see how that one does.
Thank you. You're being very humble, but actually, Colin, thank you so much for taking some time out to speak to us. We know the life of a co-founder is extremely busy all the time and a multiple juggling act. So thank you for being here. So a little unusually, I would like to start with an excerpt that occurs in one of your brochures. Which I think is a perfect starting point for us in this conversation. And it goes a little like this. Speaking voice. There is a pretty clear spectrum when it comes to whiskey that pits authenticity and idiosyncrasy at one end of a spectrum with generic product and deceptive marketing on the other. There are examples of crossover, but they are rare examples. In this business, you are out to make either perfect whiskey or a quick buck, and those end goals generally lead to wildly different places. Now, I love that statement. It just positions the conversation really well. So my first question off the back of that is, where does Kings County fit in that spectrum?
Well, I would certainly position us on the idiosyncratic side of the spectrum. Certainly, nothing we make is aiming to be generic, and all of our marketing, we can't even afford marketing to be deceptive. So we aim, the only thing we have really is the sort of truth of our production. And so we don't really have a whole lot of imagery or storytelling to lean on. But I think, especially with American whiskey, which I think has really deviated from its original tradition in terms of how it's made, mostly because it became really the purview of a handful of global corporations that were operating these brands. And really the sort of small family-run distillery kind of died out. It doesn't exist in the United States, or had not existed until maybe the last 15 years, where some people like us and other distillers have opened. And the marketing around American whiskey was really trying to tell that story of, oh, we're small, we're handmade, it's a family tradition, it's a, we haven't changed
Small
anything
batch.
in 100 years. Yes. And just as a Kentuckian, and that's an important piece of this, is I grew up in Kentucky. It was hard to see people around me getting excited for this commodity thing that I felt like was really sort of cheapening what bourbon could be. And so, as a person who sort of believed in the idea of American whiskey and lamented the fact that American whiskey really did not exist in a sort of in the way that if you go to a restaurant in New York City, you can eat food that comes from farms that are around the city. You can, if you have questions, you can find out the answers to where all of your food comes from. And with whiskey, if you ask questions, you would get very ridiculous storytelling.
Interesting.
Sometimes it was true, sometimes it was not true. And, kind of was insulting the consumer. We had evolved, and I think the industry had not. And it was still in a sort of, mindset of, we'll just get it done with billboards and celebrity endorsements,
Yes. I mean, and those are promotional channels and tactics that even out with the American whiskey world are employed and have successes in their own right. But I guess going back to this sense of commoditization, this very big word for a podcast, and these quick buckers, as we've put them in that excerpt, do you think as a result of that, consumers are befuddled? I've just created an own word there, but like fundamentally just have no understanding of what true American whiskey is. Is that where we're at?
Well, I think there's a style of whiskey that has prevailed, which is a very homogenous commodity style. You know, I mean, if it's like, if you never knew anything other than fast food, fine dining would be weird to you, you know? And so I think that's a little bit the situation that we're in with American whiskey. That's not to say it's not sustenance. It's full of salt, you know, people like salt. So, you know, there's a sort of, and it does the job. I mean, we're talking about alcohol here. And so ultimately, you know, who really cares that much? Not that many people. So, you know, there's some sort of asterisks and caveats to all of this, but I do think there's enough interest in the sort of food side of food and beverage where the farm to table movement and people have engaged more deeply with farmers markets in the last 20 years. And so why wouldn't we apply that same logic to spirits? And the truth is, 20 years ago, people really didn't have any options for small spirits in the United States. Nearly everything was produced in a sort of commodity fashion. And when I say commodity, I mean literally you have giant factories in the Ohio River Valley that are making whiskey that is designed to be interchangeable. Nobody is actually making whiskey in any sort of unusual or specific way. There are 3 recipes. There's high rye bourbon, there's low rye bourbon, and there's wheated bourbon. And you can sort of maybe mix and match and blend a little bit within that. But, you know, there were not people who were experimenting with distillation techniques. Nobody was experimenting with barrel sizes. It was really, let's make whiskey and then let's figure out how to maybe gussy it up in the very back end.
And market it.
Yeah. So the levers that people had to pull were age and proof. And so consumers began to invest enormously in age and proof as the markers of quality without any real, you know, knowledge or awareness that there's all of these other things that can make a whiskey good. And certainly age is a factor. It's an overstated factor because it's an easy thing to latch onto. And if you can count on your fingers, you can be a whiskey connoisseur. But the ideas of Kings County was really, let's in fact start with making 0-aged whiskey and see what the factors are and what the variables are that make a difference for that. And when you strip age and proof away, then you start to really engage with the fundamental project, which is distilling. And so Kings County has always been positioned as a distillery first. The brand name is Kings County Distillery. And so the brand is, you know, is inseparable from the distillery itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And the mission that it's trying to achieve.
Right.
You talked about your starting point being unaged whiskey, and ignorant podcast host over here had to do some Googling to really understand what that really meant. And we talked briefly about this internationally. We've accepted there is always a white spirit, and what's potentially happened is we might have opinions about the value of a white spirit.
Sure.
And I think that's kind of underpinned the thought leadership you've created with you and your co-founder at the beginning with these release of these books. It's about educating about the history behind American spirits, and a lot of the real American whiskey kind of started with this unaged whiskey or basically moonshine.
Right.
So, and that's your first book. So tell me, how did it's your first book. It's certainly a topic you wanted to talk about. And your book was around, a guide to urban moonshining, which is quite interesting because it's not only talking about the history and calls on, you being a Kentucky man and from that particular area in Kentucky. It's also quite bizarre that we're talking about it because it's illegal.
Right.
It's just, I think it's still illegal in the US, but it's definitely illegal in the UK.
Yes.
So why dedicate a book to it, and tell us a little bit about actually how that underpins King's County story.
Yeah. So I mean, I grew up in Kentucky, but in Kentucky there are sort of two sides to the state, or there's sort of the bluegrass Kentucky, where you have all the beautiful horse racing, and you have bourbon, and you have this sort of highbrow imagination of the opposite side of the state, which is most of the state.
Yes.
Which is, at least in my part, there was coal mining, there was moonshining. It's not drastically different when and moonshining. It became very clear to me upon moving to New York City that moonshining and bourbon were really the same, two different interpretations of the same product. Moonshine was the lowbrow, lower class way to make a living if you were poor and you lived up in the woods, and bourbon was just the articulation of that with a lot more money and a lot more time and a lot more, there's a little bit of tradition that's evolved separately. And this to me was something to kind of share with people, because people come over to my house for parties and they'd say, well, you're from Kentucky, you must know about bourbon. And I would say, yes, I could talk to you about bourbon, but here's some moonshine. You want to try that? Because that's like the real thing. And so there's nothing like kind of calling the bluff of somebody who wants some, $100 bottle of which, is ultimately maybe not that impressive and probably isn't worth $100, to actually then present them with something that can't be bought, that is made by a real person and who controlled the process from beginning to end. Now, that's not to say that the moonshine that I brought from Kentucky was all that interesting or good, but I think it sort of unlocked something in people's minds, and it unlocked something in my mind, which was just that there is an opportunity to create genuinely a small batch in a marketplace where people are sort of primed to appreciate small batch because of all of this somewhat deceptive marketing. And so really that was sort of the discovery moment, or really the discovery moment was when I realized I could make the moonshine instead of getting this Kentucky stuff, Eastern Kentucky stuff, not Central Kentucky stuff, and could make it without having a grandfather in the Beam family, without having a chemical engineering degree. I mean, I'm just a guy who has never even homebrewed beer. But distilling gives you, you can take from the best part of the run, you can take from the broadest part of the run and have the biggest yield. You have those variables right in front of you to select for quality versus yield in every single distillation run, and it's pretty apparent as you're doing it how you can manipulate it in your favor. So it became clear to me that there was, that this is a highly mystified process that is actually extraordinarily straightforward. And because it's illegal, nobody wants to fool with it. Frankly, I understand that.
Enter Colin.
but the same thing happened with beer in the 80s. I think it was Jimmy Carter in 1979 legalized home brewing in the United States. After Prohibition, long time, sort of unlocking this kind of hobbyist movement. And the same thing in the US happened with the internet, which unlocked the hobbyist movement, which allowed people to anonymously share information on how to do what they're doing and how to buy stills, which, I couldn't build a still. Maybe, probably now I could. But in those days, I didn't know how to work with copper, work with, the kinds of things that you would need, and also as a novice, you don't really understand everything. So you're just, you kind of want to be, anyway. So I could buy a still off the internet and run it as a hobbyist. And that was a big, I think, breakthrough moment, not just for Kings County, but really for craft distilling all across the United States.
Yeah.
And so with some state level, and alcohol is usually regulated at a state level in the United States. So, or let's say majority of the regulation is at a state level. So as states were creating laws that were permissive to craft distilling, also you have maybe a generation of people who have learned by tinkering through the internet at a small scale, illegally, but with a goal of going legal, to some extent. If the government were to legalize home distilling, all of a sudden there would be so much more revenue available to the federal government. So it kind of, the prohibition moment is finally so far behind us that and also I think after prohibition, people really wanted big commercial industrial facilities making their alcohol.
Yes.
Because they didn't trust the sort of hobbyist or the home distiller to know what they were doing, and maybe it would be adulterated, and there's a shady component to alcohol because it's a vice, and it's like your drug dealer. You have to trust your drug dealer, I guess. I mean,
yeah.
So
it's easy to see why you would want to go to something quite established. Right. Yeah,
right. I don't think we've reached the moment where we want like artisan pharmaceuticals. From the drugstore.
No.
So, alcohol existed in sort of a weird space between, let's say, medicine and food. And I think the past 50 years have pushed us pretty squarely towards food, where it belongs. And that has opened the door in the sort of public consciousness for, the kind of craft distillers that I think are really filling that hole in the market, which was for things that were made more authentically and arguably made more like what is traditional to Scotland and Ireland, where they have legally protected their way of doing things. So everything about Kings County, if you look at it, really just looks sort of like a single malt Scotch distillery. But we're using that to make American whiskey. And so that, I think, is what makes it sort of, especially more internet, like what Kings County is doing, all of a sudden has slightly more international appeal because we're playing by rules that have been established for a certain class of spirit around, for 150 years.
Yeah, completely. And I think particularly because you're based in New York, a city that's probably not got a lot of heritage or association with whiskey, you are sort of employing more tradition and heritage through those means, whether it's and at Kings County, you do so through your distillation process, your fermenting, that it takes advantage of some of the learnings of how we create single malt Scotch up in Scotland. So that was that quite a novel move?
Well, I guess I would say, in a way, no, because if you're making something at a small scale, you inevitably do things that suit a small scale and which inevitably are traditional. So it wasn't a decision to go make things in a traditional way. It's just that when you're only making 4 barrels a day, you have that much more control over the process. You have that much more, the ingredients mean that much more to you than when you're distilling corn by the rail car that comes to you from, that comes by train. So, and also, I mean, I do think the culture of New York City is an important distinguishing factor because we're not manufacturing something which we're shipping out necessarily to the world. We're really manufacturing something for our community, which itself is an internationally diverse community. And so when people come to the distillery and they say, well, I don't really like bourbon, I'm more of a Scotch drinker, we want to be there for that person. And if that person goes to Kentucky, they're going to make a folksy joke and say, this is all we got. So I think for us it was a little bit like understanding that we had a slightly broader constituency, and a more not necessarily sophisticated constituency, but one that really did come from all around the world. I mean, that was the that is a differentiating factor of New York versus even other American cities. So
yeah, and you've used it as a bit of an opportunity, but I can imagine going back to New York not being really well known or associated with whiskey distillation. I'm sensing, and I might be wrong, there must have been a challenge with that, is introducing a new brand of American whiskey.
I think it is still a challenge where people, they have, I think it was the same challenge of California wine,
Yeah.
People assume wine has to come from a particular region, and people assume bourbon has to come from a particular region. And New York is really the opposite of Kentucky culturally in the United States. I could say that kind of with pride for both sides. And I think that, it's barbecue is sort of the same thing. If New York, actually, there's some great barbecue restaurants in New York because it's a great culinary city, and people would not put something out that didn't hold up to the standard of the city that we're in. But at the same time, there's also that sort of knee-jerk thing, like, well, if it's not from Texas, how could barbecue come from New York City? So
totally,
yeah, right. But I also think like we've kind of acknowledged that is going to be a perception, but at the same time, we didn't set out to make Kentucky bourbon. We set out to make bourbon in a way that harkened back to an older age. And we make rye whiskey, we make single malt whiskey, we make. I wouldn't think of us as a bourbon distillery. I would think of us as a whiskey distillery. I just happen to like bourbon a lot, and so does the audience. And so we were, somewhat smart, I think, to lean into bourbon before rye, even though going forward, I think we're interested a lot more in rye whiskey.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we just look at your credentials as a business, and you've been, you're not a small craft distillery. You are of, established size. You've been running for, is it 14 years? You have, and I would arguably say that your portfolio is pioneering what whiskey could be. And you can only look at the list of awards that you put your humility aside. There's a lot of awards and recognition that's come across the industry and association bodies that have keeping an eye on what you're doing. So you've got your flagships, blended, straight, peated bourbon. You've got your unaged whiskey that we talked about, your moonshine. And you've expanded that repertoire with spiced whiskey, coffee whiskey. That is intriguing to me. Then you've got your limited editions and so on and so on. Your portfolio is wide reaching. Your brand is quite premium that I want to delve into a little bit more. But before we do that, when we talked about, I've seen it in some of your collateral. We've talked about it in our conversations, is this idea of your business cannot work with all this work that you've put into flavor and authenticity. You quite clearly said that this business doesn't work without blind testing. So without blind tasting, rather. So that's a core part of your route to market. And you mentioned this term that I hadn't come across, is this idea of sensory distilling, this idea of being agriculturally driven, sensory driven discipline, and going back to those roots. Why is that so critical? And is it a differentiator for you?
Well, I highlight that because I'm not entirely sure that consumers are doing a lot of blind tasting. I think people, even, it shocked me that at the San Francisco Spirits Competition, which is generally perceived as the premier spirits competition in the United States, maybe the world.
Yep.
that the judges can ask for the age statement of a whiskey. That seems like important information that should be kept hidden from somebody who is trying to objectively judge a spirit in a blind setting. And
Okay. Yeah.
I just think it's very difficult for even these so-called spirit critics or the people who are running magazines that write about whiskeys. Like, they don't taste stuff blind as much as they should. And some people do, obviously. But it just isn't a discipline that people feel confident in. And I just think like it's so important to confront your own inability to distinguish one thing from another. I mean, how do we get to a place where you take the mid-shelf bourbon from Woodford Reserve to Bulleit to Buffalo Trace? They all taste the same. Nobody can tell those whiskeys apart in a blind test, unless they've had them, within maybe a half an hour or something. If you come back to them 3 days later, you forget it. So of course, there's sort of a feeling of helplessness when it comes to blind tasting, because you can just, but I think I want to just deputize people to say it kind of tastes the same. And so unless you're doing that work of sitting in front of samples and struggling through them and trying to find what you like about them, inevitably it does lead you to a different place. You come to a place where you prefer things that are more flavor forward or have unusual notes, or you sort of disengage from the notion of perfection and start to get into a lot of the nuances, but not in a way of this sort of notion that people have in their minds that there's some ideal bourbon that's worth $100,000 per bottle that's sitting, and Scotch is even worse, but by getting into the sensory analysis and really letting that lead our process, I think, and I'll say I'm not the person who is most often doing it. We have Ryan and Nathan who are, authoring the whiskeys in a certain sense, and Nicole before that. So, and Nicole really set the process and the standard for how we make the whiskeys. She's now the head distiller at George Dickel in Tennessee, and has completely remade George Dickel. I mean, in the last, in the 5 or 6 years that she's been there.
Yeah, fantastic.
I think by bringing some of the kind of stuff that we started at Kings County to one of those heritage commercial industrial facilities. And it's really exciting to watch that. It's exciting to watch a company like Diageo, which has this amazing, incredible resource in this heritage distiller that mismanaged it for decades. When, as consumers, we're getting really excited about American whiskey, still kind of was flat-footed until they kind of found the right person to communicate what was exciting about that distillery through its products to consumers. And so, I think we're all doing that work of, we know what we have through sensory analysis, and then how do you assemble those barrels? Because ultimately you're just building a sort of piano keyboard of all different barrels into products. That's the real work that I think, as much as distilling is really important, you're ultimately kind of, in our minds, creating this, again, sort of keyboard of different flavor notes based on barrels and barrel size and barrel age, and sometimes mash bill if we're talking about blended bourbon.
Yeah, I think it's such a unique talent. I'm not even sure, and that would be really good to explore what it is that how you would train that sort of that skill set, and I'm pretty sure there's not many people out there. So very much a shout out to Nicole and of course Nick, who is at King's at the moment.
Right. I mean, I would actually say, not to take anything away from them. Obviously, I believe in their palates, and I believe there's a little bit of a innate talent that they bring to it. But also, I think people don't trust their own palates, again, because we've been given all this stuff that sort of tastes the same. And the first question I sort of get is, a lot of times when I meet consumers who don't know anything about the brand is they're like, what makes your whiskey different? Which you wouldn't ask that question to a brewer. You wouldn't walk into a brewery and be like, what makes your beer different? Because they would just say like, I don't know, we make it differently. I mean, we add like, here's our apricot lager and here's our hazy IPA. Here's our different recipes that we manufacture because we like the flavor of them. But with whiskey, people are just so, kind of tuned into, well, it all tastes the same. They want to hear why, they want to explain why it's different as opposed to trusting their own palate. And I mean, that's a failure of the whole whiskey industry.
Well, I mean, it's a lack of education in general, isn't it? Of like, we mentioned it earlier on in our conversation about, American whiskey, how many people actually care. I think there's a growing movement of just curious buyers who do want to share and do want to use their purchasing power to actually educate themselves as to what they like. I think the world of whiskey is becoming more accessible to a consumer, as to what maybe stereotypically was a whiskey drinker is no longer that stereotype, or at least it's a diminishing stereotype. So these ideas of what makes the flavor what it is and why that's unique is something that the onus is on the independents and the craft distillers and drinks producers to really convey that language,
right?
So, because we're interested. I am interested. It wasn't something I was a whiskey drinker before, but I've talked to too many passionate people now. It's a done deal.
right. It's hard to go to vodka once you've been to whiskey.
100%. So we're going back to talking about Kings County, the brand. We talked a little bit about it's a premium brand, which is unusual. How do you go about deciding that was your position? That was your position you were going to take in launching Kings County?
Well, to some extent, there was an awareness in being a hobby distiller, like how much actual corn goes into this. It was pretty clear that there's pretty favorable margins on spirits, especially if you can recover the majority of the bottle price. I mean, if you buy a $100 bottle of whiskey, only 30 of those dollars are going to the distillery, and within that, only about $3 are going to raw ingredients. So, there was a little bit of a
puts everything into perspective.
Yeah. There's something very appealing about the sort of math on this, and also just there we didn't have any competition when we started. I mean, it was the advantage of being the first is that you get to sort of define the market that you want to enter.
That's right. Yeah.
And so interestingly, in 14 years, we haven't ever changed our prices really on any of our whiskeys as the market for American whiskey has come up. And we got a lot of flack for that in the beginning when people would say, why would I buy a 2-year-old whiskey from New York when I can buy a 12-year-old whiskey from Kentucky for $23? And I think that was, there are answers to why you would do that, but I don't know if they were the most compelling. But now that 12-year-old Kentucky bourbon is $300, and the 4-year New York bourbon is $75. So we've actually now reached a point where I would argue we genuinely propose a value proposition that is responding to some ridiculous hype around the Kentucky products. And but I don't know that I would have predicted that that's the way things were going to go. And I don't exactly know that's the way things are going to stay. I mean, I think there's very soon to be sort of an oversaturated market for Kentucky bourbon. And I think ultimately the interest in the market is going to go towards this sort of regionality that exists in many other parts of the spirit making world. I mean, there's a map of Scotland that shows different regions, and maybe I don't know if people really invest that much in those regions, but we could have the same thing. Yeah, exactly. We could have the same thing in the United States. And I think it's even starting to emerge that Texas whiskeys have a sort of characteristic because of the climate in which they age.
Yeah.
And the Pacific Northwest had no tradition or culture of distilling, but they had a lot of breweries. So you have a lot of beer-driven whiskeys, malt whiskeys, American single malts from the Pacific Northwest. You have rye whiskey is really the heritage of the Northeast. And that's kind of one of the reasons that we've begun to lean into rye, is that there are no heritage brands of rye that are made in the Northeast. So where rye originally was distilled, and that's Pennsylvania, New York, and Maryland. And so if we can reclaim that rye making heritage, then we can kind of win both people, the people who insist on geography and the people who insist on quality.
Flavor.
Yeah, we could kind of we could get you both. So so that is an exciting project that is still going. There's still, for every one bottle of rye sold in the United States, there's 50 bottles of bourbon. So it's a little bit of an uphill climb, but I think that's where things are headed.
Plus marginal gains. We're just etching at it. So
if we sold double the amount of rye that we sold last year, it would it would change nothing about anything at all. So,
well, that's an interesting dynamic. So we've established almost, but entering a new market as a new entrant, you're setting the tone. You set that tone, challenged by that, and with these regional perceptions, that's actually now become an opportunity, that we've got these regionalized characteristics, which I think is really an interesting dynamic. Let's talk about your packaging, your premium position. You, of course, before this premium position was established, you started with mason jars and neon labels. I could be wrong with that.
Yeah, no, that's right.
Which I think there's a really interesting photo that people must be able to find on the internet of the early years with a not so different Colin, much younger, but he looks
Right.
exactly the same, dabbling with a bit of moonshine. But when it came to establish the tone and the look and feel of Kings County, considering all the confusion around American whiskey, considering all the noise and the, in your words, cornucopia of bottles out there, which I thought was just a brilliant phrase, what did you want to achieve with your bottle?
Well, certainly the main differentiation between Kings County and most other brands is that we make our whiskey. That's with the exception of the huge brands like Maker's Mark. It was important to communicate to people that we were making it. And therefore, it's sort of, and in a way, this was not something that was really all that thought about. It was just like, let's avoid pretending that we're a bigger brand than we are. Let's avoid trying to enter the sort of back of bar bottle wars. We started with a 200 milliliter bottle, which is not a standard size. I mean, it's a or a 375 bottle after a couple of years of doing it. So by being in that funny size, we were already in a different section of the store, already sort of up near the register as an impulse buy. And a bottle of Kings County was $20 or $23. And that's like a bottle of wine. And it has the same amount of alcohol as a bottle of wine. So there was already this kind of, let's put a bottle out there that's sort of going to just get out of the same sort of physical territory in the retail store. Again, not something that was like super well thought out, but that's just, we were small and that's the way it happened. But one thing that was a little bit conscious is using a typewriter to make the labels. So to avoid using the computer, which pushes you in a particular direction in terms of graphic design. And so by avoiding the sort of design altogether, I mean, just put on the label what the government requires to be there. You make something that's at once completely mysterious and weird and like, what is this thing? Which then maybe people want to find out or ask. And when you have a hand sell product, you need to create the opportunity for the hand sell. So you have to have something that somebody's going to pick up and say, to the store owner what is this thing, and hopefully they know about it and are happy to tell the story. So that was a big piece of it that, again, kind of subconscious, but was there all along. Really, just the point was to be different from everything that existed, as a way to reinforce the fact that what was happening in the back end was very different than everything that existed.
Yeah, so living your brand.
Right. I think that was the sort of, if you look at anything in retrospect, is if there was anything that worked over the last 14 years, it was really that the match of the packaging and the appearance to the consumer and the actual behind the scenes process, which was pretty lo-fi, doesn't use a lot of computers, is held together with materials found, on the sidewalk kind of thing. So, it's a scrappy operation. And I think that was communicated in the bottles. But at the same time, you're also aiming at this sort of luxury market. But it's a luxury that is real, as opposed to a luxury that is sort of invented by the sort of brand people who say, well, we need to have something in a crystal decanter and charge for the decanter. And
it's interesting though, isn't it? What does luxury actually mean to different audiences? And I think the take in the US market, the how that translates, is a completely different aesthetic than potentially in the Europe.
Right. Sure. Yes.
More classical luxury feel.
Right. And it's a different demographic. I mean, what's luxury to people I'm the tail end of Gen X, but everybody I think below me has a different impression of what luxury is, and a probably more grounded. I sympathize with that audience more than necessarily the audience above me in terms of their consumer habits, because as a child of the 80s, we had 4 television channels and 4 brands of everything, and there wasn't the opportunity and the multiplicity that exists in the market today. And so that's a good thing. I mean, multiplicity is a good thing. Diversity is a good thing in every way across the board.
Challenges. Yeah. It brings its own challenges, like you say. And then I guess that's where branding takes precedence. But we are almost burdened with choice now, especially because we've got global reach. So you're not just competing against your 3 other well-known whiskey brands in the locality that managed to reach that retail store. It's you're competing with off the shelf, et cetera. So this feel of this typewritten wraparound label that you have, and I quite like it because you said it as it is. It develops that intrigue. We're still trying to put that into branding now, like develop those hidden intrigues that get people asking questions, because then you get more power of voice, and those people who do know the answers to those questions, you feel like that sense of belonging. I'm in on the inn. I know exactly what that place is about. You might not know, but I'm a loyal follower, and it just gives that community sense. But your glass, it looks like a flask, if you will, but it is a custom glass bottle.
So when we started with 200 ml, there was just a barbecue sauce bottle that was pretty widely available. And kind of the only reason we did that was, as opposed to the mason jars, my business partner was like, it's too on the nose. You gotta lose the mason jar. It's not a good look.
Good call, David. Good call.
Yeah. In retrospect, that was the right decision. And then there was another New York distiller, Hudson, that had these sort of Boston round apothecary bottles. So we wanted to go a different direction from that. Right. And the flask, again, maybe a subconscious thing, but if you're buying at retail in New York, you don't need a 750. You don't want a big or 70 CL, like a big bottle. You kind of just need the thing that you're going to take to the park and or the thing you're going to take to a dinner party and be done with. So that so there we were going to do a custom 200 ml, but then it took us a long time to come up with a 750 bottle, because there's no flask size of 750. You can't really do it. But it took this British company coming to us and said, let us help you imagine what it could be. And so they, to some extent, designed the bottle. And it was really appealing, and it conveyed some of the luxury that was maybe missing out of the barbecue sauce bottles, which really were just stock, inexpensive bottles.
But you got to start somewhere.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, it is interesting. We have become a little bit more mainstream and a little bit more deliberate in our appeal to the high-end consumer with the larger format bottles.
Yeah.
But they're still pretty minimalistic, and they're still, typewriter labels, and we haven't added, even a logo is something that we sort of struggle with as a company.
But I mean, you've created your own core brand assets, though. But by doing that, like it's a specific silhouette. It is a specific look.
Right.
And I was just about to say, it feels deliberately pared back, and relying more on the color of the liquid to do the talking.
Right.
Which is quite a nice factor.
Yeah, there's this great ice cream brand out of Brooklyn that is that's what they do. It's just a rainbow of different colors, and I really think if you are a business that wants to communicate creativity, then having that sort of rainbow of presentation creates the sort of collect them all kind of or try them all kind of consumer mindset, which is certainly what we are after. I mean, I would say if you want to understand Kings County, it's very hard for me to ship you one bottle. It's much easier for me to send you 5 small bottles, so you get to see what we do with single malt whiskey, and what do we do with rye whiskey, and what do we do with bourbon, because they're all different interpretations, and they're very specific. And so if it's hard to define us by one thing, but we're defined by this sort of
and that goes back to that accessibility again. Is you access the brand through one specific flavor that intrigues you, and you are keen to explore more now that you've built that trust with that brand. So I think it's my last question around the packaging. I know I'm laboring the point because I love packaging, but would you do it again in the same way?
I mean, I would not do it again, just because you just can't go back. And I think ultimately, like, we live in a different era now. I mean, that was really 15 years ago. It was the advent of the internet in a lot of ways. It was the advent of consumers finding information out on the internet. People had been communicating with email, and people had been to websites and things like that. But this was really where people began to engage with consumers and build businesses. You could basically build a small business with a website, and that was, you put that around 2008, 2010, and it was happening all over Brooklyn. There was this, sort of almost comical backlash to the pickle business and the coffee roastery and the chocolate company that were all artisan, and sold their products online and interacted with the world through a website. And that was, it was different and sort of easy to make fun of, but it was a change in the way that people do business. And ironically, we're in a moment now where a lot of consumers have gotten so used to buying stuff online that I think actually beer and specifically and spirits are suffering a little bit because it can't be bought online. I mean, it can in some instances, and there are workarounds, but it's not like Amazon. You can't buy alcohol, at least in the United States, on Amazon. So and even when you do buy it online, you're really doing a 4th tier of a 3-tier system. It's very it creates a lot of friction. So I don't know. I mean, we're in a different era that's more driven by social media, which itself is more algorithm driven. So, starting a business now, you have to appeal to the algorithm, and the physical locality may not make any difference, or the model may not make a difference, because in a way, it's just how does it appear on TikTok? So. And that's a world.
That sounds so miserable, but also very true.
Yeah, right. Or how does the bottle look in the AI generated rendering? That's gonna appeal more broadly than the physical bottle itself. So, we are entering an era of sort of consumer engagement that I will be dead honest, I completely don't understand. And I feel at the mercy of the algorithm in so many ways. But there are people who do get that and will see the opportunity in it. And my hope is just that we are big enough and established enough in traditional retail and in traditional markets and doing something that's interesting enough that if you get on TikTok and talk about it, there are a few people who care about it, even if you don't necessarily, you're not just trying, you may not be beating the algorithm, but you're meeting the consumer where they are at the very least. So,
but also where you zig, where they zig, you zag, and if that is where everyone is throwing themselves, there is something to be said about doubling down on the traditional routes. Because others will not be there.
Right. No, it is my fantasy. Yeah, my fantasy is that we can get a catalog, a paper catalog that we can send to people, and that is how I
fantasy. Paper catalog is so doable. Get on people's desks.
It would be. I'd have to find a legal way for people to, because they can't order from us. They have to order from a retailer. So I would, maybe in partnership with a retailer, it could be done. And that would be sort of an interesting project to begin. But then it would have to be a partnership with 2 or 3 retailers for compliance. But anyway, it's...
And then the cogs start to tick.
Right. It does seem like New York State may be at a position where they might legalize small distillers able to ship to within New York State. And there's some legal precedent that means that could enable us to ship to other states.
Interesting. Yeah.
And that would be exciting.
So, I mean, those are potential avenues for next steps for Kings. We're only, it feels like the first 14, 15 years, we're still at the very beginning of what Kings is going to be. And it's really exciting. And we're going to have to schedule in a catch up and see if in a year's time you've managed to achieve the paper catalog. But acknowledging that I've now overrun completely and taken way too much of your time, I'm going to just end on one last question. And this may be the most difficult question of all, or the simplest one. Looking back at Kings County, what you've created with your co-founder, David, if you were to encapsulate the brand in just one word or phrase, what would it be? Okay, so it was the primary where it's the most difficult question.
Yes. Wait, in one phrase?
In one phrase or one word. I mean, you're not a rule follower, so you can do whatever you want.
Right. I mean, it's really whiskey as it used to be made before industrialization. And I don't know if that's the most salesy thing to say. But
it's not a sales tactic. Just people understand.
Right. And you could walk into the distillery and be like, well, there's electric pumps in here. Like, what aren't really? like what is, this is not right. So, I mean, that's a open to interpretation statement, but the next point of that is really American whiskey. Like nobody's ever tried it before. And so it is a little bit like if you've never had American whiskey from pre-Prohibition, which most people have not had, although I've gotten to try a couple bottles from the 1920s and the 1930s, and whiskey was very different. It tasted very different back then. And so possibly that positioning is kind of leads to a sort of people to mentally to it in an interesting place. So
100%.
I guess that's kind of, that's how I see the brand. Whether or not that's what other people, I think there's ways of saying we're ultimately more accessible than a lot of whiskeys out there because we are so transparent, and we are, to some extent, I think we encourage people's humility. When we're talking about blind tasting, like it's okay to say it doesn't taste any different from the one that came before it. I think that's part of our brand is letting people acknowledge what they don't know, and to trust their senses, and to trust their ability, and trust their interests. Like if you're interested in something that's made in an old-fashioned way, why is that? Well, it supports local agriculture, and it's more sustainable, and it keeps money in the hands of the community. Like there's a lot of reasons that go into, there's a lot of consequential impacts of doing business that way that I think are embedded in maybe that fundamental sort of statement.
100%. And I think that's, we should open this up when this is published to you all who encounter it in the future, full stop. Tell us, what is it? If you've encountered Kings County, tell us what you think would encapsulate this brand in one word or phrase. And if I'm going to end with an action, although I am going to put a disclaimer to say drink responsibly, is to blind taste. Go have a go at blind tasting with some, with a portfolio out there you're choosing, and share your thoughts, share your taste notes, share your insights. We'd love to hear from you all. Colin, thank you.
Thank you,
We
Leanne.
finally got there in the end. It was so lovely to spend another hour with you, and let's definitely stay in touch and see how the onward journey of Kings County is going. I'm excited. I'm also likely to make a purchase of the coffee whiskey, because that just is delightful.
Very cool.
All right. See you soon,
Yeah,
Colin,
thank you for
and
having me.
we'll take care.